This episode of the Creep Street Podcast is brought to you by Martini Coffee Roasters. You know, people always look at me weird when I say I start off every morning with a big old martini. But then I set them straight, and I tell them I'm talking about Martini Coffee Roasters coffee. A delicious coffee made by the Martini family. They roast their coffee using a traditional method of sight and sound to roast those little babies to perfection. And they also sell green coffee beans for those home roasters out there. And right now, fans of the Creep Street Podcast can get 20% off their entire order by using the code CREEPSTREET at martinicoffee.com. Once again, for 20% off your order, use the code CREEPSTREET at martinicoffee.com. Martini Coffee Roasters, the perfect coffee to keep you creeps caffeinated.
You've taken a wrong turn down Creep Street.
Citizens of the Milky Way, this is Maureen Bogey.
And this is Dylan Hackworth.
And you are listening to the Creep Street Podcast.
Ooh, God, oh man, I hope we make you feel beautiful.
We want to make you feel beautiful. We want to make you love every inch of yourself. This podcast is about loving the freak that you are, baby girl.
And freaks we hope you be.
Because here we are all about cults, spookiness, ghosts, cryptids, conspiracies, true crime, urban legends. Am I missing anything? Just a lot of other stuff.
Many jewels are in this crown.
And we are here for you. So if you are a fan of the cast, we ask you to please like, rate, subscribe, tell a friend, share us on social media. Also, you can follow us on social media. We are on Instagram at Creep Street Podcast, Twitter at Creep Street Pod. We are also on TikTok. We are also on Facebook. And on our Facebook page, we have a subgroup called Citizens of the Milky Way. And that is just a forum where anyone can post articles, memes, stories, questions, anything like that. We also engage in there, and we post a little bit early what the episode is going to be each week. So feel free to check that out at Citizens of the Milky Way on Facebook.
Ooh, yeah, yes.
Now, we've been hearing a lot lately that people want more content from Creep Street.
We hear it all the time, folks.
We hear it all the time that you're wanting more, that you're hungry for it.
Oh my God.
You need it. You're aching for it.
You're aching. Oh, you're quaking in your boots. About to bust.
But here's the thing. We've got great news. It's over at patreon.com/Creep Street Podcast. Okay, there we have all sorts of bonus goodies that you are going to absolutely love and that are just gonna get you where you need to go. Okay, we've got interviews, we've got short stories, we've got spoiler casts, we've got movie commentaries, we've got full bonus episodes, and anything and everything in between.
Oh, yeah.
So feel free to check that out once again at patreon.com/Creep Street Podcast. And we have 3 separate tiers for you there. We've got a $2 tier, a $5 tier, and a $10 tier. And that is all billed monthly. So for just $2 a month, that's enough money that you honestly just forget about it.
Yeah, forget about it.
You know, it doesn't even count at that point. It's not even real money, okay? And you get some great bonus content from Creep Street. It is hot, it is dangerous, and we love it.
Yes, we do.
So, Dylan.
Yeah.
Now that we're all caught up on what we needed to catch up on.
Uh-huh.
I want to know.
Ooh.
What are you rocking our world with this week? What's the episode?
Ooh, today we've got an episode that is quite literally out of this world.
Whoa.
Folks, this week's episode is the Aurora Texas Spaceman. All right, let me smother and cover you with my sources. My main source was a short book called Aurora Texas 1897 UFO Crash, The Real Story? It had a question mark at the end. by Stan Hayden, and then a little bit of the Parcast's Unexplained Mysteries podcast.
Whoa.
They did a two-parter on this.
We
and
love.
a little bit of Mysterious Universe, and also an OG article from the Dallas Morning News that was published in 1897 that I will be reading.
Whoa, okay,
Yeah.
so we're going back.
Yeah, so we are going back, and that is why I really dig this episode. I find this story very fascinating.
Okay.
I think most of us think of the UFO phenomenon as something that began in the 1940s, especially after the Roswell incident of 1947.
Okay.
But in reality, UFO sightings date back to the beginning of recorded history. It's nothing new, baby.
No, it's nothing new. It's been going on for years.
And that's why I find this story so fun, is because it happened in 1897
Wow.
in the tiny town of Aurora, Texas. Now, I just like the blending of themes here, you know? It's like extraterrestrial visitors mixed with Wild West, you know what I mean?
Yeah, hell yeah.
Just before the turn of the century, it is said that an extraterrestrial craft landed in this small town, and that the operator of this craft is even said to be buried in the town's cemetery. So before we get into the day of the crash, let's give you a bit of backstory about the town itself.
Okay.
When our story picks up, this was definitely a town on hard times. Since it was established in 1882, Aurora, Texas had always been a small town, but when it was founded, there were originally big plans in the works that would have put the town on the map. For a while, surveyors from one of the major railroad companies had been eyeing the town as a stop along the famous cross-country railroad. This would have been a huge deal to the town, as you can imagine. It would have brought in all sorts of jobs and business and tourism from abroad. And the town had really put their faith in the railroad, choosing their town as, you know, a stop along the railroad, especially after several years of tragedy and hard times. Agriculture had long been a problem for the town. Farmers had overplanted back in the early 1880s, and over time, the soil done lost its mojo.
Oof, you hate to hear it.
With each passing year, crops suffered more and more, and it was a big blow to the economy. And then the fields that were fruitful were devastated by an infestation of beetles.
Oh, God. Can't catch a break.
Cannot catch a break. But that was only the beginning. A fire would ravage the town in the mid-1880s. It was a gusty day and a fire broke out, and the entire western portion of the town was destroyed, leaving many residents homeless, not to mention many businesses burned to the ground, which also further killed the economy of the town. Then in 1889, the town fell victim to spotted fever, which is a tick-borne illness.
Oh, God.
Most of the town fled to avoid the sickness, moving to other nearby towns. Overnight, the town was pretty much vacated, but those that remained held on to the potential hope that the railroad may make their town an official stop. But after a long and bureaucratic nightmare, interest in the project and the town dried up. Eventually, the nearby town of Rome, Texas, was chosen as the stop by the railroad, and the station opened there in 1891. After a decade of hardship, the one thing the town had put their faith in was no longer going to happen. It seemed that the town of Aurora would soon vanish entirely and be lost to the history books. But on the morning of April 17th, 1897, the nearly dead town would suddenly become the location of one of the strangest UFO cases in U.S. history.
What?
So, that's a little story about the town.
Okay, here we go.
And before we dive in, let me just tell you a bit about my main source.
Okay.
So the article that was first published about this story came 2 days after, on April 19th, 1897, in the Dallas Morning News. It was an article written by journalist S.E. Hayden. After I tell you the main story, I will read the original article, as it's not really that long, and we can discuss it. And my main source is, like I said, a small book called Aurora, Texas, 1897 UFO Crash, The Real Story, written by Stan Hayden. So Stan Hayden is actually the great-great-grandson of the journalist S.E. Hayden, the journalist who originally broke the story back in 1897.
Okay.
Just to be clear, Stan Hayden makes a point to emphasize that he himself is not actually sure he actually believes in the story himself.
Okay.
The story, which he writes out in the book, is what has been passed down to him through his family for generations. I'm sure things have been added to it and exaggerated over time. Technically, this short book was actually published as a fiction title,
Stan says he chose to do this simply because he didn't want to publish a story as true if he didn't really believe in it himself. So, just to clarify, we're not saying the story is fiction.
Right.
Only that he isn't sure he believes in it himself, the author of the main source. In fact, he said the generations before him and even his own father are adamant that it is all real. So with that said, let's begin. It's the morning of April 17th, 1897, and it's around 6 a.m. in Aurora, Texas. Sheriff Thompson is in his office when suddenly he sees a bright light go streaking through the sky. And a moment later, boom, an explosion was heard that seemed to shake the ground. Every window in town rattled. The sheriff quickly ran outside, and it was clear he could see a plume of smoke billowing up in the distance, and from where the sheriff was standing, the smoke seemed to be coming from the land of Judge Proctor, who owned a large chunk of land outside of town. So the sheriff hopped on his horse and started making his way out there, and along the way came across several curious residents who had also seen and heard the ruckus. One such person he came across was a man named Silas O'Toole. Now, Silas had a reputation of being the town drunk, and even then, not long after 6 a.m. in the morning, Silas was clearly drunk out of his mind.
Ooh.
And the sheriff could smell it on him. Despite him being drunk, it was obvious to see that Silas was very scared of what he had just seen. He told the sheriff a craft had just crashed, and it was one of those cigar-shaped airships that had been making a stir in the news recently. Cigar-shaped.
Yeah, we hear about that all the time now, too.
Yes,
So
yes.
weird. I just kind of assumed that started in, maybe like the 50s or something like that. But no, all the way back in the 1800s.
Yeah.
So bizarre.
Actually, at the time, there had been a string of stories in the papers across the American Southwest about mysterious craft in the sky shaped like cigars. These stories would eventually spread all across the rest of the country, and sightings increased tenfold. Not only that, Silas said he claimed to have seen what he called a demon exit the craft.
Oh, God.
He was certain that this was the beginning of Armageddon. And as wild as these stories were, the sheriff told Silas that he was simply drunk and that he needed to go and sleep it off.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, babe.
So the sheriff took off, continuing his ride in the distance towards this plume of smoke. Next, he would come across a group of farmhands that he recognized. They worked at the nearby Walker Ranch. One of them was a guy with the last name of Rosen, and he flagged the sheriff down to tell him what they had just seen. They claimed that an airship had come streaking down from the sky and crashed into Judge Proctor's windmill, completely destroying it, and before then crashing to the ground several yards away. He told the sheriff that they had seen a small creature escape from the wreckage of the crash. He claimed that it had approached his sister, but that she screamed so loud that it took off running. Him and the rest of the group were chasing after the thing and said they couldn't wait there long in case they were to lose the trail. Well, some of the men split off and kept pursuing the creature while Rosen agreed to take the sheriff to the crash site in question. By now, many of the townsfolk had heard that there was a strange creature running around, and they were all armored up and either hiding in their houses or out on the hunt. Rosen hopped onto the back of the sheriff's horse, and the two continued riding toward the crash site. Along the way, they would pass several people, each of whom had their own story of the events that had just taken place. Some people were deathly terrified, and others were curious. What was going on?
Yeah.
When they finally reached the home of Judge Proctor, it was obvious they were in the right place. Not only had the judge's windmill been reduced to a pile of burning rubble, but every window in the judge's house had been blown out by the shock of the sound and impact.
Wow.
Shards of metal were stuck in trees, and what also looked like molten metal had even embedded in the ground and into rocks.
Oh, my God, that's crazy.
Yeah. Then, about 100 yards farther away, was what appeared to be the crash site, and it looked as though whatever it was had hit the windmill on the way down. They could see black smoke billowing up from the earth, and about halfway between them and the crash site, they could see Judge Proctor surveying the damage and the crash. The two of them rode out to Judge Proctor, and they greeted him, saying, "Good morning," and the sheriff asked him what the heck had been happening out here, and the judge said he thought some hooligans had just been having a prank, probably using some dynamite. See, as the local judge, it wouldn't be a surprise to think that some of the locals may have a grudge against the judge, especially if he had locked them up or one of their family members. Even with that considered, the sheriff thought it was a pretty elaborate prank to use dynamite and such. Even if they blow up the windmill with dynamite, what's with this burning crater like 100 yards away?
Right.
Well, the sheriff is like, well, Judge, I mean, half the town is saying they saw something come out of the sky and crash out here on your land. He said Rosen, the man with him, even claimed he saw a ship crash into the windmill and that a little creature even escaped from the wreckage. Both the sheriff and Rosen were shocked when the judge claimed that Rosen was, quote, a damn liar, and that this was clearly just the work of pranksters. Rosen quickly went on the defense. He's like, what? Rosen claimed that before he had even seen the creature himself, he had seen the judge chasing it with the gun.
Yeah.
And that it was the judge who actually told him that it was a ship that crashed. Well, the two men start arguing and shouting back and forth, and the sheriff is like, both of you just shut up. I'm just going to have a look at the wreckage myself. So he left the two men bickering behind him and continued walking. As he approached the spot, he noticed things along the way. He saw strange scraps of metal that he couldn't identify. And this sort of stuff was hard to come by in this region, and it was actually very precious, highly sought-after stuff, metals like this. The closer he got to the burning pile, he could tell there was something there. And when he finally reached it, his jaw dropped in astonishment. Lying in the middle of the heap and surrounded by fire and smoke, he saw what was a long, sort of silvery tube with windows along the side of it. It was about 12 feet long and 5 feet in diameter. One end of this tube was smaller than the rest of the craft, like it had been rounded to a point. At the other end of the tube were 3 thin metal triangle-shaped extensions. 2 extended out from the sides at the bottom of the tube area, and another protruded from the top pointing into the sky. And the pointed end of the tube had been all crumpled, as we can assume, by the impact of the crash. All along the side of this thing, it was dented. But it keeps getting weirder. The sheriff noticed what seemed like a door, and it was open. Peering through the smoke, the sheriff could see through the door and see what looked like a seat and some gauges that looked similar to those in a steam engine. So the sheriff, he's just standing there in silence, just shocked at what he's seeing. Not only was this the craziest shit he'd ever seen, but it was clear to him now that Rosen had actually been telling him the truth and that it was the judge who was lying. So the sheriff turned around to make his way back, and when he was startled to see the judge was standing right there behind him, he confided to the sheriff that Rosen, yes, had been telling the truth. And the sheriff asked him why he would lie about it, so the judge told him everything he had seen. He said when the thing hit the windmill and then hit the earth right after, there was such a huge explosion that it literally shook the house and blew all the windows out.
Wow.
He said at first he truly did think someone had used dynamite in order to scare him. So he grabbed his gun and rushed outside, afraid he might find himself in an altercation. But the first thing he saw was the windmill, and it was now just a pile of burning rubble. He knew whoever had done it wouldn't have had time to flee, so he figured they must have been hiding out in his barn. So with his gun raised, he reached the barn and looked inside, and slowly made his way around inside, but found nobody. Well, that's when he noticed it wasn't just his windmill, that about 100 yards farther away, there appeared to be some sort of an impact crater, and that there was a blaze going out there. So gun still in hand, he approached the heap of burning stuff out in the field, and that's when he noticed what seemed like a tiny person crawling out of the rubble. This thing, he said, stood about 4 feet tall. Its body was the color gray, and it had an oversized head with these big black eyes. And it scared the living daylights out of him. He said it crawled from the wreckage on all fours. He could see that this thing was not an animal because of how the knees bent. He said it almost looked like how a child might crawl on all fours. And the judge watched stupefied as the thing crawled a distance of about 15 feet from the wreckage, and then it just collapsed on the ground as if it was completely exhausted. And he watched in silence as it lay there for a number of minutes. Eventually, the thing mustered the strength to rise up, and it stood on its 2 legs like a human. And that is when it noticed the judge standing there staring at it. The creature then extended its arm, holding out its hand at the judge, and it began to walk towards him. The judge didn't know what to do, so several times he shouted at the thing, demanding that it stop. Stop where you are. He raised his rifle, warning one more time not to come any closer. When the being was about 10 feet away, the judge fired. The creature was struck on the side, and it seemed completely stunned. It looked at its wound, and then looked back at the judge, tilting its head to one side. And after a minute, the creature took off running, vanishing into the woods. So there we go. Was it trying to talk to him?
Yeah, that is a really good question, and I wonder what that was all about.
Well, we haven't seen the last of this guy.
Okay, let's go on.
A few seconds later, after the creature had disappeared in the woods, the judge says he heard a woman scream.
Oh, no.
And that's when he saw Rosen and the other farmhands come running a few minutes later, and they told him they had just seen this strange little creature and that it approached Rosen's sister. And when she screamed, the thing just ran off. And the description Rosen gave to the judge was the exact same thing he had seen, so he knew they had seen the same thing. Mm-hmm. So he instructed Rosen and his men to trail it and go track it down. That would have been about the time Rosen bumped into the sheriff. The judge explicitly expressed to the sheriff that they could not afford to have this thing running around. If someone got hurt or killed by this thing, the already down on its luck town would be done for. It was absolutely imperative, the judge said, that they find the thing and kill it.
Oh, whoa.
The sheriff agreed, and the two of them, along with Rosen and the other farmhands, formed together a posse.
Okay.
Within about 20 minutes, everyone was armed. Their canteens were filled, and they were on their way looking for this thing.
This is, some classic 1800s shit.
This is cowboy shit.
This is straight up getting together with your pitchforks, maybe literally, maybe not, and popping off.
They're doing some cowboy shit here. Rosen and his men had to catch up with the posse as they were in another area, but they were surprised when they saw a group of the men headed back to the way of town and not on the trail of the creature. In fact, 3 of the men were carrying one of the other men who had clearly been injured somehow. One of the men was Rosen's friend, Clem, and they stopped and asked the men what had happened. Clem's face was ghostly pale, clearly shaken by whatever they had encountered. Even the injured man just kept quiet. Clem told Rosen that if he was him, he would just turn back now. Seeing what they had seen would only haunt him the rest of his days. When Rosen asked Clem to elaborate, he only said it was too terrible to speak of, and that he would never speak of what he had seen. So,
wow.
Boom shakalaka.
Boom shakalaka. It makes you wonder, what could that have been?
What could it have been, folks?
That's kind of like this classic thing where it's like it's almost scarier when you don't know exactly.
Absolutely.
Because it's like, oh my god, it could be anything. I'm making it the scariest thing that I can imagine.
Absolutely. Well, that was certainly weird. But not everyone turned back, though. The sheriff and the judge and some of the other posse had continued their hunt. And after a while, Rosen and his guys were able to catch up to them. They found them in a clearing in the woods, and the men stood around the creature, who lay dying on the ground. In fact, what was once so terrifying, they now kind of looked at the creature in pity. It lay there, barely breathing. Its mouth, the source described as like a small slit in the shape of an oval, and it looked up at them with an expressionless face. The sheriff then hushed the men, as it seemed like the creature was trying to communicate. They could barely hear what sounded like a sort of gurgling noise, like it was trying to speak but was too exhausted. The sheriff was certain it was trying to speak, or at least trying to communicate in some way. So the sheriff hunched low to the ground and slowly approached it. And as he did, the creature turned its head and looked at him, and it slowly began to lift its hand toward him. And that's when, bang, a shot rang out. There was a quick spray of blood, and the creature's arm fell lifeless to the ground. It was dead.
What?
The sheriff looked up to see the judge holding his rifle.
Oh, whoa.
He shouted at him, "God damn it, what the hell have you done? The thing was trying to communicate. How are we ever going to know what it was, or what it was even here for, or where it came from?" The 2 men got into an intense shouting match, and the judge said they were never going to learn anything from it because it didn't speak their language, which, what a dumb thing to say.
Yeah, it's like,
what a stupid fucking thing. Just so fucking silly.
Yeah, it's like, well, maybe we can find another way
to talk, right.
to communicate in some manner.
So dumb. The judge said the sheriff should be thanking him because for all they knew, he may have just saved his life. What if that thing was just playing hurt and then went crazy on his ass? The two men had to be separated as it was about to come to blows. But after some time, the men were calmed down, and the judge said that they needed to get everything cleaned up before the whole town was walking through the crash site, taking souvenirs, and despite being furious with him, the sheriff agreed. I mean, dang.
Dang. Ding dang. Another classic case of just people shooting shit.
Yep, if you don't know what it is, pull the damn trigger.
Pull the damn trig, baby. Yeah, wow. Okay.
Rosen fetched the bedroll from one of the horses. I'm guessing that's sort of like a sleeping bag.
Who could know?
Figuring that they could put the body in that for the time being. Clem and some of the other farmhands went with the judge back to his house to help him get the house cleaned up. The sheriff told Rosen to go to the undertaker in town and tell him they needed a cheap coffin and for the grave diggers to dig up a plot in the local cemetery. He told them that if the undertaker asked any questions, not to answer anything and just to tell him that the sheriff would be paying for all the charges. And so that's what the men did. By sundown that evening, almost everything had been taken care of. The judge and the farmhands had destroyed what remained of the craft by using a stick of dynamite, and the bits that remained were dropped down into the well that stood right by where the windmill once stood. They cleaned up what was left of the windmill too and stacked it up into one big burn pile on top of where the craft had crashed. Once that was taken care of, the judge sent the farmhands into town with some cash, and they purchased new windows and installed them at the house, clearing out the broken glass from before. While Rosen was fetching the undertaker, the sheriff wrapped the creature's body up in the bedroll, making sure it was completely covered. When he came back with the undertaker, they delicately placed the body into the casket and rode it out to the graveyard where the empty plot was waiting, freshly dug. The place where it was to be buried was right beside the oak tree that stood in the cemetery. They helped the men lower the casket down into the hole, and to be sure no one took a peek at what was inside, the sheriff and Rosen stayed to help the men bury it. The judge swore the farmhands to secrecy, and likewise, the sheriff swore Rosen to secrecy as well. At noon the following day, a Christian funeral was held to honor the dead.
Wow.
Yes.
That's kind of surprising.
All in one day. Busy day.
Yeah.
It came down in the morning, and by nightfall, they had it buried with
They did a whole ass Christian funeral.
Yep.
Wow, I'm kind of surprised by that.
Local news had even gotten wind of the story and were out there the same day as the crash had happened, chatting with anyone who would talk with them about what happened. The reporter's name was S.E. Hayden, as we know, and his story would be published in the Dallas Morning News on April 19th, 1897. And as we know, 5 generations later, his great-great-grandson Stan Hayden would write the short book that we used as the main source here. And he makes a point to stress that this story, like I said, has been passed down for 5 generations. Who knows what has been embellished along the way?
Right.
Well, I thought now would be an interesting time to read the original article that was published in 1897 in the Dallas Morning News.
Oh, hell yeah.
It's not long, so let's have a listen and discuss.
Okay.
At about 6 o'clock this morning, the early risers of Aurora were astonished at the sudden appearance of the airship which had been sailing through the country. It was traveling due north and much nearer the earth than ever before. Evidently, some of the machinery was out of order, for it was making a speed of only 10 or 12 miles an hour and gradually settling toward the earth. And when it reached the north part of town, collided with the tower of Judge Proctor's windmill and went to pieces with a terrific explosion, scattering debris over several acres of ground, wrecking the windmill and water tank and destroying the judge's flower garden. The pilot of the ship is supposed to have been the only one on board, and while his remains are badly disfigured, enough of the original has been picked up to show that he was not an inhabitant of this world. Mr. T.J. Weems, the United States Signal Services officer at this place and an authority on astronomy, gives it his opinion that he was a native of the planet Mars. Papers found on his person, evidently record of his travels, are written in some unknown hieroglyphics and cannot be deciphered. The ship was too badly wrecked to form any conclusion as to its construction or motive power. It was built of an unknown metal, resembling somewhat a mixture of aluminum and silver, and it must have weighed several tons. The town is full of people today who are viewing the wreck and gathering specimens of the strange metal from the debris. The pilot's funeral will take place at noon tomorrow.
Well, how about that, Creep Street? Very strange indeed. Now, just a little news flash for you. So, Maureen and I recorded this episode, and for some reason, right when we got to the part where I read the article, I guess our mic stopped recording. So, Maureen is away on tour for over a week, and even though it's a week before this episode even comes out, she will not be back to re-record the last portion. So it's just going to be me, but it's not too much more of the episode. So in case you're wondering why Maureen suddenly became silent, it's because I had to re-record the last bit without her. But we're going to do our best without Miss Momo, but we love her and we miss her, and she will be back soon. So yes, that article, like I said, that was the original article written by S.E. Hayden back in 1897. And it should be noted that other reports mention interesting things about the visitor. Some say that when they found the wreckage that the visitor was actually already dead and his body badly disfigured. We saw that just now in the article that S.E. Hayden wrote, saying that it was already dead, that there was no chase between the sheriff and the judge and a posse of men like that. They're saying, according to this original article, as far as we know, that didn't happen. And some sources say that the creature had multiple arms and legs, like more than just the two of each that we would have, And it said there was this strange notebook found in the wreckage that had some sort of unknown alien language that was written in some kind of like hieroglyphics, something we couldn't decipher. But what's also interesting is some accounts, they say the creature wore a thin metal armor, almost like a breastplate. And it had these hieroglyphic symbols on it as well. It's also said that after testing it, it was determined that the craft was made of a sort of mixture of aluminum alloy and iron. This would have made the craft weigh several tons, and of course, from what they could tell, there was no engine propelling this thing, So, and keep in mind, it's not until the next decade that the Wright brothers would, man the first motorized flight, the first motorized plane. So seeing something like this was definitely freaky, especially in 1897. So you might also be wondering, why is this case not more well known? Well, it just so happens that in the 1890s, there had been a rash of these airship sightings that were sweeping through the region. And some of them, of course, have claims in them that are rather dubious. For example, one encounter mentions, this person said they met with this group of creatures who claimed that they were actually a lost civilization of people that lived in the North Pole. So, and some even claim that these airships were actually secret cutting-edge technology that the Rockefellers created, and they were using them to escape to Mexico to avoid being charged on, business monopoly crimes, that sort of thing. So the Aurora, Texas story just kind of got lost in the fold. Well, in 1945, the land that was once owned by Judge Proctor was bought by the Oates family, and they were unaware that any of this had happened decades prior. But right away, a member of the family named Brawley Oates noticed strange things, especially regarding the well. The well, of course, had long been closed up, and Brawley thought it would be great, to renovate it and actually use it as a water source. So after clearing out the debris, they were surprised to find lots of strange metals down there. And it wasn't long after that the family realized that absolutely nothing would grow on their land, not even weeds. It was freaky. And a few years later, the Oates family even lost their daughter tragically to a mysterious illness. Doctors were unable to find any reason for her ailment. Brawley himself came down with severe arthritis, even growing tumors in his hands. Within a few years, he couldn't even use his hands. After much observation, doctors wondered if perhaps Brawley's condition wasn't due to radiation poisoning. And Brawley realized that something was definitely wrong with this well, so he had it sealed up and had a cement concrete chicken coop built over it. He was convinced till the day he died that he had been poisoned by some sort of extraterrestrial thing, whether it was bacteria or virus, just whatever his exposure was to it. That is what ailed him. That is what took his daughter's life. But many people think the story of, the Aurora Spaceman was always originally drummed up to get some tourism to the town. Had S.E. Hayden just made up the story that he published? Who knows? And since then, there have been other people have kind of rediscovered the case. History Channel did a special down there where they did all sorts of stuff and claimed to have, discovered weird things. But that's kind of where our story ends, and that's where it's going to wrap up. And I'll tell you something. Boy, oh boy, do I have a list of names I wouldn't mind blowing up my windmill. Folks, the names of our top-tier Patreon subscribers, of course, the Dream James Watkins, the Finish-Face Via Lungfist, the Madman Marcus Hall, the Vivacious Vicky McHugh, the Tenacious Teresa Hackworth, the Heartbreak Kid Chris Hackworth, the oh-so-suave Sean Richardson, the British Bonebreaker Bex Martin, the Notorious Nicholas Barker, the Terrifying Taylor Lashmet, the Count of Cool Cameron Corliss, the Archduke of Attitude Adam Archer, the Sinister Sam Kiker, the Nightmare New Zealand Noeline Vivilli, the Loathsome Johnny Love, the Carnivorous Kevin Bogey, the Killer Stud Carl Staub, the Firestarter Heather Carter, the Conqueror Christopher Damian Debaris, the Awfully Awesome Annie, the Murderous Maggie Leach, the Sir of Sexy Sam Hackworth, the Evil Elizabeth Riley, Lauren Hellfire Hernandez Lopez, the Maniacal Laura Maynard, the Vicious Karen Van Vuren, the Arch Nemesis Aaron Bird, the Sadistic Sergio Castillo, the Rapscallion Ryan Crum, the Beast Benjamin Huang, the Devilish Chris Doucette, the Psycho Sam, the Electric Emily Zhang, the Ghoulish Gerd Hankum, the Renegade Corey Ramos, the Crazed Carlos, the Antagonist Andrew Park, the Monstrous Michaela Scheer, the Witchy Wonder J.P. Weimer, and the Freaky Ben Forsyth. Yes, folks, of course, if you want to join that cool list of cool folks, of course, just head on over to patreon.com/Creep Street Podcast. Give Creep Street a thumbs up or a 5 stars on whatever you listen to us on, however you absorb the content. Of course, evangelize the name of Creep Street. Tell your friends, your family, your loved ones. It all helps, and we are so thankful to have you here because you are what makes Creep Street so wonderful. Citizens of the Milky Way, I'm Dylan Hackworth. Maureen Bogey loves you so much, and I'm sorry that I had to do this last part all by myself. I must have done something stupid. But both Mo and I and Banshee love you all so much. Good night and goodbye.